You're watching Wisconsin Eye, an independent, nonprofit public affairs network, engaging the citizens of Wisconsin since 2007 through access to government proceedings and public policy events. To support programs like this, please consider a tax-deductible donation at wisci.org/donate or by texting WISI to 44321.
Oversight. Thank you to Wisconsin Eye for carrying this important topic today from us. We're excited to talk to you today about the Wisconsin constitutional amendment process. We will cover items that have come up in recent history in Wisconsin in terms of amending our state constitution. Jake will walk through the process in Wisconsin and talk about how we compare to other states for amending the Constitution. We'll talk about some important amendment referendum questions that will be on your ballot coming up in August and November of this year yet. And then we'll talk about some future casting. What could this topic be used for, this reform tool be used for moving forward when it comes to reforms, important reforms in the state of Wisconsin. Again, we're excited to have you with us. This is our first edition of the Institute for Reforming Government's Dome Dispatch Live. If you are a regular supporter of ours, we also have a weekly edition, email edition of the Dome Dispatch, where we talk about important topics taking place in Madison, covering the Evers administration, covering state agencies, the legislature, the courts, and campaigns. If interested in getting that email, reach out to us and we'll help explain how. But for today, again, we're talking about the Wisconsin constitutional amendment process, and we're excited to get going. Jake?
Thanks, Chris. It was a good introduction. We think this is a very, very timely topic, particularly with the number of amendments that have recently passed, and we'll get into detail about that. The amendments they're actually on the ballot for the primary this fall, and then also the general election. So again, timely topic. We certainly want to make this interactive. If at any point you have any questions or comments, there is a comment box that you can use, and we may answer them right away or leave them until the end, depending on where we're at in the presentation. But certainly, please let us know if you have questions, comments. So we just want to start with the basics, right? So just what is the process for amending the Wisconsin Constitution? So to amend the Wisconsin Constitution, legislators in two successive legislative sessions actually must pass a proposed amendment and then present it to voters for ratification or obviously rejection. And as we'll get to later in the presentation, right, that's critical because you have to look at first consideration and second consideration. And you will have scenarios where something might pass at first consideration, get to a next legislative session and not pass. So that's obviously critical. They have to be two successive. They have to be identical. A few technical things. It must be published 3 months prior to the election. So the election on which they are going to appear on the ballot has to be 3 months. Must be scheduled for a general or special election that has been interpreted to include a primary, which is interesting. As Chris and I will kind of discuss here in a little bit, if you go through the history of or recent constitutional amendments, and we and other scholars kind of look at 96 as kind of a watershed moment, and really the kind of the recent history of Wisconsin amendments. It's typically going to be a spring general or a fall general. That's what makes the two upcoming amendments very unique. It is the August primary. And so we'll get into that later as far as how that can maybe impact what happens this August. Just a few, I think, kind of legal things, and I think it's important. These can be challenged. And so we have two cases, one from recently, 2023, and then another from 2010. So on one hand, the legislature is granted substantial discretion and freedom in how those amendments can be drafted and submitted to the people. But in 2010, I think an important case, when the court looked at kind of how the questions were actually drafted, you can actually violate the constitutional provision under Article 12 if you essentially have multiple subjects or as the court said, two distinct and separate purposes, not dependent upon or connected with each other, right? If you're in that scenario, you're essentially going to have two or more questions. And again, we'll get into the details on some of the recent history. There are certainly scenarios that we had it just last spring where you actually have two separate questions, right? So you certainly could have one pass, one not pass. Typically, they either both pass or both don't pass, but you can actually have separate questions on the ballot, and actually we'll have that here in August. So that's the process. A couple kind of nuances. So actually, the Wisconsin Constitution allows for a constitutional convention. So again, Article 12, Section 2, both chambers of the legislature, so the Assembly and the Senate, would have to vote in favor, and then a constitutional question would be placed on a statewide ballot, and then the electors would vote to either call or not call a convention. If they would, the legislature must convene a convention during the next session. We looked at really did a deep dive on the history, could not find any examples. If there was a vote, it was probably something that took place not in recent history, but it is an option and one interesting. Certainly in today's political environment, it's certainly a possibility that somebody at some point may call for a constitutional convention. But obviously, typically, it's going to be initiated by the legislature in two successive sessions. I think a really critical point: we do not have citizen-initiated ballot measures. Again, ultimately, yes, it's the Wisconsin electorate that will vote on an amendment, but it has to be initiated by the legislature. That is distinct from other states. So 23 other states do not provide for any sort of statewide citizen-initiated ballot measures. And so just looking in particular at the Midwest, that includes Indiana, Iowa, and Minnesota. However, 26 states do provide for at least one form of a statewide citizen-initiated ballot measure. So that can be the citizens calling for a constitutional amendment, the citizens actually calling for direct passage of a state statute, or the veto by way of a referendum of a state statute. And as we'll see here in a second, we actually have a map from Ballotpedia, right? It kind of runs the gamut. There are a number of states that have all three options for the electorate. Some will have two, some will have one. And then, as we just mentioned, there's 23 states, including Wisconsin, that don't have any. In kind of looking at the Midwest again, I noted the ones that don't have anything. Illinois does allow for citizen-initiated amendments. And then Ohio and Michigan would be in that category where all three, amendments, statute, and veto of statutes, are allowed.
Yeah, an important item, I think, Jake, to walk through a little. The Constitution is really meant to be where rights are enshrined for the citizens of a given state. It's not meant to be a document that is necessarily covering all of the laws and the statutes of a state. That's why we have a set of actual state statutes that are much larger, rightfully so, than the Constitution. And at times, if the process would be too easy, and maybe that's been the case in other states, their Constitution can become almost too big, too unwieldy, where they are, then have to consider as a time to cut it back. And we're seeing, at least in one state right now, I think Louisiana, they're doing that. They're going through the process of trying to call their Constitution back and have a constitutional convention because it's been amended so many times. So as we think about the Constitution and the rightful place for amendments here at IRG, again, for us, it's really looking at what are the reforms that would get at the rights of the people and ensuring the proper governance of the state, not a place just to enshrine any policy topic that a group or a side of the aisle might have. So it's held for the largest and most important reforms that the people of Wisconsin have.
Yeah, no, Chris is absolutely right on that point. And if you look at, there's a lot of commentators out there who, when they're looking at various state constitutions, they do try to kind of break them up into more structural constitutions, right, governing principles, as opposed to really just a longer policy document. And actually, our next slide. So this is just a map that shows kind of the variations. Again, you do see some geographic trends. Again, the gray, and this is courtesy of Ballotpedia, who does some great work in this space. The gray are the states that don't have any sort of citizen-initiated process. So somewhat of a concentration in the Midwest, West, Southeast, New England. A big player right on the national scene, Texas, no citizen-initiated process. And then you have the dark, whatever that is, blue right? They have all three. So California, I think, is typically the one a lot of people think of in the Midwest. Again, we have Michigan and Ohio, and then you have just some interesting ones. So what is that? Purple, right? Purple would be Illinois. Amendment process. Another big player in the national scene, Florida. And then, interestingly, New York with similar to Wisconsin, no citizen-initiated process. But then to Chris's point, which again I think is a good one, I think it's really a historical point you're raising, vis-a-vis other states. So just kind of for the history nerds out there, interestingly, everybody looks to 1848. It's really 1846. The federal government gave the Wisconsin Territory the authority to draft a constitution. And so we had a constitutional convention. There's I'll have the citation here later. There's a great author that did a deep dive on the Wisconsin Constitution, our convention, and it's really conventions. You have to say that plural because we had two. So the 1846 convention really had three main points of the contention. They were looking at the creditor seizure of homes, women's rights to control property, particularly after a husband's death, and then the ability of private banks to operate in the state. There was a big debate over whether or not we wanted national banking interests in the state, kind of a fascinating topic, and it broke up into really regional differences, the Southwest, mining, agriculture versus the Southeast, because there was very little population really north of central Wisconsin, and then Southeast, more commercial interests in manufacturing. And so there was kind of a regional divide in the state that actually ended up resulting in the defeat of our first constitution, 59% to 41%. We kind of got it right in 1848. So the convention started afresh. Kind of the delegates decided it was really new delegates. Very few actually were holdovers from the 46th convention. So it was really a new group of delegates, younger, professional, and then also a good mix of agriculture delegates. They ultimately did agree, and there was consensus, and we had a constitution that passed 72% to 28%. And then May 29th, 1848, actually today, right? So happy 176th birthday to Wisconsin. That's when President Polk actually signed the congressional bill approving the new constitution. To Chris's point earlier, so scholars have pointed to kind of the two enduring qualities of our ratified Constitution. So it's kind of a constricted government. You look at certain offices, for example, the Office of Attorney General, right? Not have a lot of inherent authority. That's statutorily driven. Even the governor, right? I mean, certainly there's some inherent authority with the governor, but a lot of statutorily driven authorities. You look at counties, right? Creatures of the state, Chapter 59, all kind of laid out. And certainly it's been developed with case law. But a lot of scholars look at the Wisconsin Constitution as kind of constricting government. And then to your point, Chris, it's generality. And that's proven out by, frankly, just the word count. At roughly 20,000 words, it is a relatively simple document. Particularly, you compare that to kind of the other end of the spectrum, Alabama's almost 400,000 words. That's 10 times the national average, and 977 amendments. Which then kind of leads us to, well, where do we stand as far as amendments? And so our Constitution, right, it's our basic framework. It's one of only 19 states still using their original Constitution. Interestingly, a lot of states just wholesale scrap their Constitution. In fact, and it's not even a historical phenomenon. Since 1960, 10 states have entirely adopted a new Constitution. So obviously ours has been amended. By our counts, it's about 204. So that differs a little from, and I actually have the site here. Professor Stark really has written the preeminent, at least in recent history, book on the Wisconsin Constitution from Oxford Commentaries. His number is a little lower. We include the repeal of amendments. We kind of think that's a critical action, right? So you have original amendments. You can amend amendments, which actually we'll see here in a second is happening really as we speak. And then the repeal of amendments. We all think those are substantive actions relating to the Constitution. So our count is 204. And really, but we still have an enduring Constitution. Only 5 states, all New England, have older constitutions. And then since '96, and we'll get to this in a second, there's been 14 key amendments, and I think we can talk about those and see some of the trends. So, and I know Chris will have kind of some insight, having been in state government for quite a while, but I think it's important historically, starting in 96 and it's somewhat arbitrary, but again, that seems to be kind of in recent history, some key amendments that have taken place. Again, you can look all the way back to 1849, I think was the first one, right? It almost immediately started getting amended. So November of 98, right to keep and bear arms. And that passed pretty overwhelmingly, almost 74%. And throughout here, we're going to note kind of the key top of ticket race, because there's certainly, I think, particularly as we're getting kind of more and more divided and partisanship kind of seeps into everything, there might be an assumption that, well, right, if there's a quote unquote progressive or quote unquote conservative amendment, that's going to directly track a partisan election. And really, as we're going to see here, since 96, that has not been the case. So again, the first example here in November 1998, right to keep and bear arms. I think most people agree traditionally that's right. That's a center-right issue. And you had Governor Thompson, yes, with a kind of a resounding victory, almost 60%, but almost 74%, right, supported that amendment. So you clearly had at least 14% kind of crossover vote there. This would be an example of two very distinct amendments. Sometimes there's some nuance, but we had two amendments on the November 98 ballot. So a completely separate kind of issue relating to the terms of office of sheriff. So not really a hot button issue, maybe just a difference of opinion as to whether or not it should have been 2 years originally or 4 years. That passed very comfortably with almost 74%.
Yeah, and that really does just drive home the point that the Constitution, being saved for the largest and most important topics, voters tend to take personalities of elections out of it. So an election might be extremely partisan, of course, in recent years, they almost all are. But there's still typically a good margin between top of the ticket races in the state for elected office and policy questions to amend the Constitution, and largely in favor of amending the Constitution, right? The citizens in Wisconsin typically come together and they're able to support policies that are good, that are good for the state, regardless of what's happening in the kind of the war of personalities in terms of who is going to be the next governor or kind of run the legislature.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, right? As we're kind of progressing through these, it's going to be pretty obvious that certainly there's going to be a lot of suggested amendments at the first consideration, even second consideration, that don't see the light of day, right? They're not passed. But to Chris's point, if they can kind of get through the two sessions and actually get in front of the people, at least in recent history since 96, they pass. So April 1999, distribution of gambling proceeds. So statewide gambling on reservations is kind of becoming a big deal at that point in time. Basically suggesting that those proceeds, they have to go to property tax relief. This is actually the biggest margin, right? So almost 86% approval. April 2003, a pretty unique provision, right? Nationwide, actually a constitutional provision to the right to fish, hunt, trap, and take game. So that passes with almost over 82%. And so to Chris's point, and the one we're kind of trying to emphasize, because I think this can impact future referenda or amendments and elections, is you have a very tight race, right, for the Supreme Court. So again, this is an April election. So Justice Roggensack beating Judge Brunner, 51-48, but 82% support for that, right? So clearly significant crossover vote from either side.
Yeah, and we'll note as we kind of breeze through these ones on the screen, you can see the date of these past elections. And every time that the Constitution has been amended in our state's history, it's either been in the fall general, so in a November election, or in the spring general, right, in an April election. We have a couple of unique votes coming up that we'll talk about in a few minutes that are actually taking place in the fall primary, so in August of this year. And as far as we could tell, this will be the first time that a constitutional amendment will occur and likely go through during an August, during a primary election versus being either a fall or a spring general. So it's kind of the unique factoid as we move into the election season. and as voters contemplate those two ballot initiatives that they'll see in August.
Right, and then throwing even further complexities, you have redistricting, so unique legislative maps. So to Chris's point, there's a lot of uncertainty with this primary amendment, and we're gonna have to look at where are there hot races across the state and maybe see increased turnout there. So great point. April 2005. Again, more of a technical thing. We had talked about the sheriffs, now 4-year terms of office for other county officers. Really no election at the top, 75% passage. November 2006. So this is probably the best example of a more recent kind of hot button cultural issue, kind of defining marriage as a traditional one between one man, one woman. Here, an interesting result, right? So you have a gubernatorial election between Governor Doyle, Congressman Green. Pretty comfortable win, but still relatively close. But you actually have 59%, almost 60% support that amendment, and 50%, 52%, almost 53% for Governor Doyle. So again, kind of the ticket splitting that we've been talking about. April 2008, probably the most important historical amendment that has current implications. So as we're going to see, we're now talking about an amendment to this amendment, and this is where it also kind of fits together. So in 2008, we had the gubernatorial veto authority, right, kind of the Frankenstein veto, and we amended that 70%, almost 71%, very tight race for Supreme Court. So again, another example of ticket splitting, Gableman defeating Butler. And then November 2014, another kind of more current hot button issue. This relates to kind of the transportation funding and the rating of the transportation fund, ensuring that those funds actually go to transportation. Almost 80% support, a comfortable margin by recent standards for Walker's reelection over Mary Burke, but a huge margin for that amendment. Probably the best example, April 2015, the closest margin, right? So if you have been tracking these percentages, 53%, right? So probably by far the most competitive amendment that we've seen. Interestingly, though, and I think we're really hammering this point, you actually have probably the least competitive Supreme Court race, right? So Justice Ann Wells Bradley kind of runs away with it, and yet we have a very tight vote for the constitutional amendment. Marsy's Law, April 2020, huge support, 75%, not a very competitive Supreme Court race. And then just last spring, April 2023, we have the two bail questions, right? More flexibility for judges looking at the totality of the circumstances. Comfortable wins, around 67%, and another kind of comfortable win at the Supreme Court. And then just this last spring, another example of, and this is probably the best example of, you have two questions, very much related to a similar topic, but I think the legislature, in light of the case law, did the smart thing, actually separated the two, right? One relating to election officials, one relating to funding. Pretty comfortable margins.
Yeah, so we've talked about, or you've talked about what past history, and now we'll talk about what kind of has occurred in the legislature in this current session, which issues they are bringing up, not which issues are before the electorate yet in August and November, but just other issues that are obviously on the minds of lawmakers because they have entertained legislation to move these forward in the past session.
Exactly, yeah. So we think it was important to go through that kind of more recent history to kind of see some of those trends, note the ticket splitting, and now, as Chris said, I think in light, with that benefit of historical knowledge, now we can kind of look at first consideration, second consideration. So second consideration, the ones that are actually going to be on the ballot in future elections. And so I think it's important to break that down. So if you look at first consideration, this is just kind of the overview. So actually this past session, 4 passed first consideration. So that means next session, they'll have to be passed again in identical form. And if they do, then they're being put forward to the voters. And some interesting, kind of observations we can make. 6 GOP sponsored failed, right? So maybe the argument that, well, right, whoever's in the majority, they put forward a constitutional amendment, it's going to pass 2 sessions and get put in front of the legislature. That's not the case, right? So you had 6 actually GOP sponsored, some with pretty broad support within the caucus still failed, or maybe was successful in one chamber, failed in the other. And then 7 Democratic sponsored, all failed. But I think those are important to note because you can kind of see where the minority, and depending how things go, maybe at some point the majority, what their focus would be. So again, obviously we're not going to read these. You can read them for yourselves. First consideration. This one relates to essentially emergencies and whether or not churches can be closed. So this is first consideration passed. So this will be in front of the legislature again next session. Senate Joint Resolution 73, basically relating to voter ID, right? So this would be one of those really, really critical ones, depending on your perspective. And this will be in front of the legislature again next session. This relates to government discrimination based on various bases of race, sex, color. This passed Assembly Joint Resolution 109, so this will be in front of the legislature again. And then the fourth one, this relates to the increase or creation of any tax or fee, but again, in particular, kind of again, an amendment to what we have already amended in recent history, that the governor's ability to create kind of new taxes or fees. So this would definitely be a hot button issue, passed both the Senate and Assembly, and so we'll be going to the legislature for a second consideration next session. This is just a list of some of the examples of ones that the first 6 here are GOP support. So these had support sponsors on both the Assembly and Senate side, but failed. First related to 911 funding. The second relating to requiring 2/3, right, supermajority for any tax. And so this would be one, adopted in the Assembly even, and then failed in the Senate. So it might be brought forward again next session, but that would be for first consideration. The next one related to kind of a technical fix relating to powers and what it means to assume office during an emergency. Adopted by the Senate, 31-0, adopted by an Assembly committee, 13-0. And so this could have been just a timing issue, failed to adopt pursuant to a joint resolution. 2 more, ranked choice voting, kind of a hot button issue. That one was a GOP sponsor, but it failed. And then another requiring GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. That one also failed. And then one final on the GOP side. First consideration, providing for the people to have the right to pursue their chosen trades, occupations, businesses, and professions. That one failed. The next 7 are, though, Democratic sponsored, so failed as the minority party, but certainly worth noting. And I think the first one we note here is pretty critical. So as we talked about earlier, right, Wisconsin has no direct citizen involvement. This would actually completely upend that. So citizen initiative for amendments, statutes, and vetoes. And all these fail, right? So the next 7 fail. The next one related to kind of the custody of inmates. Kind of a quirky provision in Wisconsin constitutional law. Slavery or involuntary servitude can actually be imposed as a punishment. This amendment would prohibit that or remove the exemption. The next one, actually, so again, kind of a connection to one that in 2006, right, we amend the Constitution relating to marriage. This would essentially reverse that 2006 amendment. This next one, this is just basically kind of general anti-discrimination. This did not pass. And then a few more. So if you're really concerned about bidders for stationery or printing, this is a constitutional amendment for you, but this failed and actually did not have a Senate joint resolution. I think this last one is pretty critical, right? So to Chris's point earlier, there definitely is a school of thought, right, that the Constitution should be as general as possible. I think a lot of people would look at this and think these are good things to aspire to. I think the question will be very general, very broadly applicable. If an amendment like this were to pass, I think you would have decades of litigation and trying to figure out exactly what the intent of this was.
Certainly keep environmental attorneys on both sides employed for many decades, trying to argue out what each of those words mean.
And I think, again, Chris, to your earlier point, I think it's a good discussion, how general is too general, how specific is too specific. I mean, I personally would think this is extremely broad, right? So this leads to now the second consideration. Again, so we started historical, first consideration, now we're in second consideration. So these are amendments that have passed two successive legislatures, essentially in identical format, and so now they are before the voters. And kind of the first two that we wanted to highlight, in our opinion, are critical, right?
So these are anyone in the state in August, whether you have another, an assembly primary or a Senate primary or not, in your part of the state, or perhaps there's a congressional primary. Regardless of that, if there's nothing else on your ballot, these will be there. So there's a reason to get out and vote across the state. Everyone to weigh in on these two items, right?
Yeah,
right.
Great point. And probably one that nobody's really making right now is essentially when you have a referendum on the ballot like this, you are now, whatever is happening at the local level, whether you have a primary or not, it's essentially converting every election to statewide, in the sense that even if you don't have anything else, right? Like you said, no primaries in the fall, right? You're not going to have necessarily local elections. This could literally be the only thing on your ballot. And you should still go and vote. And then, as we talked about earlier, though, then it gets interesting. How do other primaries affect turnout relating to these two questions? So, really interesting dynamic. Again, probably relatively low turnout primary, but these are the two that will be on August of this year. One relates to whether or not the legislature can delegate its sole power to determine how money shall be appropriated. So kind of a delegation. You see a lot of talk of delegation at the federal level, but it very much is still a state principle. How much authority can the state legislature delegate to other agencies, to gubernatorial agencies, right? And so this is a key question. Second question, it relates to federal funding. This would prohibit the governor from allocating federal monies the governor accepts on behalf of the state without the approval of the legislature. So essentially requiring the legislature to approve or disapprove of a governor's allocation of federal funds he or she may receive. So I think we all agree, pretty wonky amendments, but they're important, right? It gets to separation of powers, delegation, and kind of the interesting political question is, are many people going to be interested in August when they're out enjoying the weather?
Right.
And to your point, if they don't have a primary, this is the one issue. So we certainly are going to be telling people this is an important amendment to get out and vote on. Not sure if other groups will take as much interest.
But I mean, vital issues though, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, thinking through just the, my third grader going into fourth grader right now, learning about state government and federal government and the different branches of government and the powers delegated to each. And this really gets at that, right? It gets at what is reserved for we the people through your elected members of the Assembly and the Senate, and what is reserved for the executive branch, and what is the proper interaction between the two when it comes to spending taxpayer dollars, whether or not those taxpayer dollars were funneled first through the federal government or not. It really speaks to that separation of power, and whether or not your local elected state official should be weighing in on that. So more to come. It'll be interesting to see where these come out. As we said earlier, again, this will be the first time that we're aware of, and we did a pretty exhaustive search, that a constitutional question will be decided in a primary election. So potentially a very low turnout election in August. So a tough one to pin down where it might go.
Yeah, and then the only thing I would add is great point. This is certainly a fundamental issue, and for those of us, particularly in the legal field, that love to kind of talk about separation of powers, it's critical. But I think you're raising an important point, right? Our team at IRG has looked at, for example, the use of ARPA funds within school districts and kind of across local governments, right? This is that very thing, right? So you have a significant inflow of federal funding. The question becomes, I know we've seen litigation, is how much of a role does the state legislature have in overseeing that allocation of federal funds? And so again, this gets to the heart of that, to your point, it's a very fundamental constitutional issue, but also a very practical one of how are we actually managing all these federal dollars that are flowing through state government?
Right. Yeah, it's not all as simple as what you learn in fourth grade.
Right. So again, that's August, and this is partly why we're doing this, right? We have a very active. We had the spring referenda. We have 2 in August, and then we have 1 in November. Obviously, a hot button issue relating to the kind of the characterization or character of a voter in the state of Wisconsin. This is essentially requires that only a United States citizen, age 18 or older, who resides in the state, is an elector. And so obviously no secret, right? We're going to have a very hotly contested top of the ticket presidential race, U.S. Senate race in the state, obviously some congressional races. So this one will not we will not be worried about voter turnout for this one. Interesting how it'll remember historically we looked at those numbers. They do not, in fact, if they were to match, it would really be the first time in recent history they have ever matched. There's almost always in some cases, a pretty significant variation in support for a referendum or an amendment versus top of ticket race. So interesting how this will impact potentially, the presidential race and the Senate race in the state. And then, just a few slides to conclude here. We've talked about historically what has been done, what was attempted to do this legislative session, what's going to be in front of the voters. Well, there's still other matters, and kind of getting back to your point about general versus specific. Some may disagree, like some of these may be too specific. This is much more kind of a note. Again, voter ID passed first consideration. It'll be up for second consideration. November of 22, Nebraska actually approved a voter ID amendment with 65%. And this is important. You can go to really good sources like Ballotpedia. We really appreciate their work, right? You can look nationwide to see kind of that differentiation between a state that maybe it passed a statutory reform, but right, statutes can be revised, amended, overturned, right? So it's that constitutional, which states have actually taken the step of enshrining something in the Constitution. And so you can kind of go to Ballotpedia and see all the differences.
Yeah, and if you think of the issues that have been brought before voters, and that we'll talk about a little bit now that are potentially coming before voters, or they are coming before voters in other states, and it might happen here as well in the coming years, they're still largely focused on those really key issues of voting, of suffrage rights, and what makes a voter eligible in the state. It's fundamental rights, whether you're talking about rights in the workforce or rights, again, like what we passed here back in the 90s and then the early 2000s with the right to hunt, things that are just really fundamental about Wisconsin and our values here in the state. We still are seeing an adherence to that, where the legislature largely is only bringing issues that are very large in their scope. Even some of the smaller items, let's say smaller, but that maybe don't rise quite to that level, dealing with cash bail, and they're still very important items that just needed resolve from the voters at the end of the day. But you're not seeing, what are there in the legislature? 2,000 plus pieces of legislation every 2 years, and only 12 to 20 various ideas that come forward on the constitutional amendment side. So, the legislature, for the large part, really does reserve these issues on both sides of the aisle, I would argue, for those really big kind of key issues that drive the fundamental beliefs of and rights that the people of Wisconsin have.
No, I think those are great points. And again, kind of going back all the way to those first couple slides when we're talking about more like structure, right? So commentators have looked at our Wisconsin Constitution and said, hey, there's generally general provisions, which is a good thing. And then there's kind of structural constraints. And so, even it's on something like voter ID, you're absolutely right? So the eligibility to vote in a democracy is obviously a very important issue. And when we're looking at kind of the various elements, right, it's 18 years old, right? There's obviously the amendment we just highlighted relating to citizenship. I would argue voter ID would be the type of thing that would fit within that category, right? Proof of identifying who you are in order to vote, right? It's not directing the type of paper to be used on the ballot, right? That would be something, let the local election clerks, maybe with some assistance from WEF, make that decision. It's not a constitutional issue. But who is voting? I think that fits within kind of that general constitutional requirement. This is obviously an issue that we're very passionate about at IRG, but that is just kind of administrative law, the issue of agency deference. In 2018, the Wisconsin Supreme Court kind of tackled that issue in the Tetra Tech decision. They then codified that in 2017. And so the question is this something that the legislature at some point looks at? Right? You have Act 21, you have the REINS Act in 2017, you have agency deference, a number of administrative reforms, and we've talked about this extensively. Really, Wisconsin is a national leader when it comes to administrative reforms. So it's a question: does this legislature at some point consider actually enshrining those in the Constitution? I would argue, and I think IRG generally would agree, like these are really important principles. Wisconsin's been a leader, and so to your point, Chris, it probably makes sense at some point to consider, are these things that should actually be in the Constitution?
Right.
Because you want to talk about fundamental separation of powers. That's really what Tetra Tech was about.
Right. That's exactly it. This really gets, this issue, it takes us back to the start when we talked about the Constitution and constitutional amendments being where the separation of the three branches really is laid out. And the real question here in agency deference, is bringing the court into it and their powers, and whether or not they should or must rely on the executive branch for decision making, or whether they have their own ability in the Constitution to have their own expertise and to look at a case and not have to rely on an agency staff member of the executive branch. So it really does get at the heart of separation of powers and making sure, in this case, it's the legislature kind of freeing up the judicial branch to fully own and exercise its own abilities and powers in the Constitution.
And this is an example of something that's happened. This is where Wisconsin actually has been a leader, right? Because when you talk about agency deference at the federal level, everybody's kind of familiar with Chevron deference, and that's being revisited by this court. And I believe Loper, I think, is the court case where the Supreme Court is going to consider that Chevron deference this summer. And so this is one where Wisconsin actually could kind of be ahead of the feds when looking at kind of the agency deference. Florida, again, just a historical context here in 2018, essentially enshrined that in their constitution by almost 62%. So that's the presentation. We should probably check if there are questions. Sure, how we would.
Yeah. All right. So we are. Yep. So we are, again, streaming live on Wisconsin Eye. So we appreciate everyone for joining us. If you do have any questions at this point, I'd invite you to send those to us now in the chat.
And I guess we have some time here while we wait to see if there are questions coming in. There's a couple other issues that I don't think we included a slide for, but right to work, right? Right to work, obviously one of the key reforms during the Walker administration. Chris, I think Chris has done a nice job really summarizing what does it mean to be something that's fundamental and should be included in the Constitution. I think most people would agree in it. Maybe they agree on the other side of the spectrum, right? That it's something we don't want to enshrine, but at least I think most people agree it's a debatable issue, and certainly within that category of possible policy reforms that are significant and should be included in the Constitution. I think right to work would fit in that category.
Right. Well, and it's a topic we have seen action on in other states, right? Tennessee just 2 years ago amended their Constitution to include the right to work. Again, a fundamental ability of a worker in Wisconsin, and so they amend their Constitution. You're seeing some others around the state look at it too. So there are certainly topics that are on the minds of folks around the country that may or may not come to Wisconsin, but that is one. Just thinking of topics that might be primed for this. Another one, there's a case right now in Dane County talking about provisions of Act 10. A controversial topic, of course, Act 10, the collective bargaining bill from Governor Walker, but it is under litigation once again, being considered by a judge in Dane County. May be a topic to look for the lawmakers to bring forward in the future, depending on how that case, or regardless of how that case goes.
Right. Well, and I guess 2 points on that. Number one, absolutely, right? I mean, Wisconsin, historically, first state to actually allow for government kind of collective bargaining, as opposed to obviously private sector collective bargaining. So 1959, right? So we were kind of like this national leader in that area, and then obviously with the election of Governor Walker, revisited that and kind of went the opposite direction. So I think a perfect example of something that is a very fundamental issue. And should at some point maybe be considered for an amendment. And I think Chris is highlighting an important point here that we really haven't discussed too much, but that's the impact of litigation, right? So you look at something like Act 10. We just looked yesterday. So two Seventh Circuit decisions, a Wisconsin Supreme Court decision, and then a fourth federal district court decision all have upheld Act 10, heavily litigated. And then to Chris's point, now we have a new challenge. I would argue with something being litigated that heavily, that may be an indicator that that's something that should be considered.
Decide the question.
Decide the
one way or
question.
other, put it to voters.
Gets it put to the voters, absolutely.
Right. And that kind of, so we got a couple of questions coming in. Thank you. I think you were kind of getting to the second question here, talking about litigation and whether that is potentially a strategy of some, that they want to see items litigated. And so they do keep amendments. This question, is talking about those on the left, but keeping questions broad so that there can be litigation to maybe enhance their ability to drive their initiatives forward. Thoughts on that, Jake?
I think that's a really good question. I guess it's possible that would be the strategy, although if you look at something like, this is still in the environmental context, the public trust doctrine. I mean, that's fundamental to Wisconsin's Constitution that has, I don't know this for a fact, but it has to be one of the most litigated provisions within the Wisconsin Constitution. I would think when that was made part of the Wisconsin Constitution, that was just a truly a desire on the part of the drafters to include, this thought and this principle that the public waters of the state are held in trust for the benefit of the state residents. Now that has been again litigated in a numerous number of contexts, and so whether or not that was intentionally put in, I would probably guess not. This newer provision, the proposed provision, if it's intentional, I mean, that's pretty creative. I think it's my guess is it's more of a truly a desire to look. We want this really important principle in that drafter's eyes to be kind of embedded within the Constitution, such that the only way it's removed is by a subsequent amendment.
Yeah, and then we have another question talking about or asking about ideas to further limit the governor's veto power of bills. I think this really gets at I'll politely say kind of the healthy give and take between the legislature and the executive branch really over the years for decades now, where the legislature and the people of Wisconsin then by voting yes, continue to kind of rein in the executive branch's veto authority, and the executive branch, really from both sides, find creative ways to try to expand and maintain and hold on to that very strong veto authority. But idea specific to the question, Jake, on how to continue limiting a governor's veto powers?
Yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts. So first, and again, I know we went through a lot of the slides pretty quickly, but remember, we're essentially seeing this right now. So you had, and I forget which year it was, 2005, kind of the original attempt to, address kind of that Frankenstein veto. But now we have passing first consideration. So this will be in front of the legislature next session for second consideration. Is kind of, again, and you have to differentiate whether it's simply creation of a new provision in the Wisconsin Constitution or an amendment. And when we look at next session, there will be for second consideration an amendment, right? We're tacking on that second sentence or that second clause to the original amendment from 2005, essentially saying that no veto can create additional tax burden, essentially. Right. And so I mean, you can probably tell the backstory here a little better, but this gets to the increase in K-12 dollars that Governor Evers essentially effectuated with his veto. And so this is a direct response. So good question. And I would say the legislature is frankly doing that kind of as we speak. Just one kind of final point. Generally, right there, we're talking about balances, right? A lot, balance between specificity and generality. I think another point to make here is specifically with respect to veto, right? I mean, you can get to the point where, I think South Carolina is typically viewed as a governor with really the weakest gubernatorial powers in the country. So I think the question is, how powerful of a governor do you want, right? And I think a lot of that relates specifically to how aggressive can they be with their vetoes. And so, as you said, there's kind of this debate between the separation of powers, essentially debate between the legislature and the executive branch as far as how much authority should that governor have to essentially, for example, affect a budget or a statute by way of a veto.
And then our last question, there's still time to get another one in if anyone has a question. But the last question we have before us now is talking about the Second Amendment, but really any topic this could apply to. And the question is one of federalism, and it's specifically if there's a Second Amendment at the federal level, why would a state also need the right to bear arms? So I think it gets right into federalism, and you could answer that question on any given topic. But
on any topic, and frankly, we could spend the next week talking about this issue. So great question, and right. So basically, I'll try to answer this in like a minute, right? So what your question is essentially relating to is just kind of federalism and kind of the preemption of federal law. And now that gets really sticky, right? Because your question related to the Second Amendment. So yes, we have a Second Amendment at the federal level, and that certainly has been litigated and significant litigation recently, kind of interpreting what it means, what the Second Amendment means, and how that relates to state statutes relating to the regulation of firearms. And I think the easiest way is to kind of, I guess, summarize this is, right, we have our own Constitution, and there certainly is a very vigorous debate happening nationwide within the state, and frankly, this has always been a debate, is how aggressively interpreted should a state constitution be vis-a-vis the federal constitution? Right. And it gets down to issues of, well, does that federal provision preempt state statute or state constitutional provisions? And if it doesn't, then how broadly can that state constitutional provision be interpreted and applied? And so that it actually is a good example, right? The Second Amendment. So the Second Amendment typically is interpreted as applying to, right, the right to own and possess a firearm. Ours is very specific, relating to, right, you can't really have anything that's going to infringe beyond a reasonable right legal limitation one's right to hunt, fish, and trap. So definitely more empowering than the Second Amendment. But there's no clean way to really answer that other than that we live in a federal system, right? And our U.S. Constitution has to operate alongside 50 other state constitutions. So it's a great question. I think the answer is, and they'll have different schools of thoughts relating to new federalism.
Well, and we're seeing in real time, right, over the last couple of years, what happens with Roe v. Wade, right? Like, not to get into the issue, but just on the topic from a legal standpoint, like if a federal issue changes and the power is delegated back to the states or relegated back to the states, then the state's constitution and the state statute applies. So having something in state law enshrining such an important right in Wisconsin, like to be able to hunt and fish, is important to have that on top of what might be on the books at the federal level.
Yeah, and essentially, I think what you're saying, I think what the questioner was asking is you can certainly have more rights, right? I think it's kind of accepted you can have less rights, but you can certainly have more rights. And so, to your point, right, we felt as a state, and the voters agreed, that it was important that we actually enshrine the constitutional right to hunt, fish, and trap. That's not a right you're going to find in the U.S. Constitution, but it's a right we have here in Wisconsin.
All right. Well, thank you. Seeing no more questions, we do appreciate, again, all of you for joining us over your lunch hour today. Again, this is the first edition of the Dome Dispatch Live. We'll be coming at you. We'll shoot for the last week of every month going forward to tackle a topic that is of interest at the time, kind of give you a deep dive as we did today on an issue that you might not have known you had as many questions about that you did, that Jake helped walk through and get at. So can appreciate your time. Thank you, Wisconsin Eye, for bringing this to all of your viewers. If you have any questions for us, you can find us at reforminggovernment.org. You can learn more about us there. Again, Chris Reeder at the Institute for Reforming Government, Jake Curtis, our General Counsel. Appreciate your time and have a great afternoon.
Thank you,
everyone.
You have been watching a production of Wisconsin Eye, your unfiltered window into legislative deliberations and public policy programming, where our mission is to provide Wisconsinites an opportunity to access the legislative process and connect with conversations that inform our citizenry. Please consider supporting our mission, and thank you for watching. Wisconsin Eye, policy made public.